All right, so this video we're going to talk about risk profiles. Boring for most, but essential for all. The really important thing with risk profiles, well, what is a risk profile? Risk profile is in an investment portfolio, is the amount of risk you need to take. Now, we all know that there is a risk versus reward relationship in everything we do, especially in investing. In investing, it's a common theme that the more risk you take, the more reward. Unfortunately, though, in today's society, people seem to think that's where it stops. They seem to forget what actual risk is. And what is the definition of risk? The risk is risk is your, let's try and word this properly, easy way to understand. So you got two kinds of things. You got risk and volatility, right? They're commonly misconceived, or there's a misconception that they're the same thing. Risk is your appetite to lose money. Yeah. So we start with a portfolio of X and we lose that money. That's the risk. The risk is that you will lose the money. Volatility is the movement of that money between now and when you need it, right? So, you look at a graph, an investment graph, that bouncy line, that's the level of volatility. How bouncy that line is versus how stable that line is measures as volatility. Whereas from the start to the end of a portfolio, whether it's lost or gained money is its risk, right? The risk is that it will lose money. But unfortunately, people don't understand this, right? And there's actually a few more things that go into creating the right risk profile for you and your investments to match your goals. And we're going to go through a few of those now, because there are three key things that make up your risk profile and how you should develop your investment plan off the back of that. Now, I want to make it very, very clear. Two of these things are covered off here, but you've got to understand there are two different types of risk. There's the risk you need, so the level of risk that you need to achieve your goals. So if you've only got X amount of money and X amount of time to put into a portfolio, well, then you're going to need to chase a certain level of risk to achieve the returns you need. But then there's the risk that you're comfortable with. Yeah. So then there's the other option is the risk level that you are comfortable taking, because you might need to take more risk than what you're comfortable with. And if you can't sleep at night, well, then that's not going to be great, right? Because you're too worried about your portfolio. There's a third one, which we'll go through as well, which is your capacity for risk and how much risk you can actually tolerate, whether or not up here you are comfortable with it or not, but what your financial situation shows. So I'll share the screen to show you sort of how they integrate together. So bear with me one sec. That didn't work. Let's try that again. All right, so hopefully you can see that. So over on that screen, what we've got is, I guess, the matrix of a risk profile. So risk required is what I just talked about then, is how much risk you need to achieve your goals. Yeah, that's what you need to take. Your risk tolerance is how much you're comfortable taking. Okay, so how much in your head you're comfortable taking, which usually doesn't align with the risk required. Sometimes you can be more comfortable taking more risk than what's required, and then you need to ask yourself, well, do I need to be taking more risk? If I don't need to take more risk, should I? Right? And then the third part is your capacity. So this comes down to things like how much time you've got left in the market, the financials down behind, what foundations you've got in place to cover the risk, and how much you can afford to lose, right? And this is really important. Now, unfortunately, most people just look at the top one, what risk is required, or the bottom right one, what risk can they tolerate. They actually put all three of these into a formula to understand what the perfect risk profile for them is. And it's really, really important that you understand that. So then once you've looked at that and you've understood that, okay, I need to understand that there's risk profile questionnaires that you can go through, and they're a bit average, to be honest with you, but they're a compliance tool for us, so we have to use them. But there's a certain process you can go through to ask yourself, really understand. You can do a formula-based approach to understand what risk is required. That's very simple. Risk tolerance, you really need to play yourself through some scenarios, if my portfolio is to lose 10%, how would I feel? If my portfolio is to lose 20%, how would I feel? If I was to lose all of my portfolio, how would I feel? And that can really gauge, what your tolerance level is. Then your capacity, well, that really usually need to speak to someone to go about that, but you need to do a few extra things on that front and analyze, what have you got backup plans facing, and what happens if you lose all this money? If the portfolio drops, how much can you afford to put back into it? Like I said, unfortunately, people forget this with investments. People are out there buying property or investing in certain investments that they just have no business being in, but I'll give you an example. A very famous footballer, I won't mention his name, recently wanted to sue one of his investment firms because they lost all of his money. However, in the start of the investment, there was quite ample risk being taken, and they had outlined that in all of their documents, but tried to play ignorance of the fact and said, "Oh, I didn't know it was going to be that risky." Well, you did, because you were chasing those returns. They put the returns in front of you, which returns align with the risk factor, but you just didn't look at the downside. You just thought risk was a positive thing, right? So you got to understand this to make sure that any investment you make achieves everything, and first and foremost achieves your goals. But secondly, allows you to sleep at night during that. The next chart I'm going to take you through is what do actual risk profiles mean. So we're going to do this in a very, you can build a very, very in-depth analytical portfolio off the back of a good risk profile. And we build all of our strategies from start to finish based on how much cash you need to hold, how much insurance you need, what your super should be doing. And you can blend, your superannuation fund might be a different risk portfolio compared to what, your child's fund is, or versus your early retirement fund or your education fund, whatever it is, they're all different. And you got to do this process for every single investment you're making. But when we look at a traditional super fund, we look at an industry fund or something like that, they've usually got a couple of categories that you can fall into. And I'll take you through what that looks like now. Okay, so you can see on this chart here, we've got the most typical looking risk profiles that you can have. So we've got a defensive, conservative, balanced, growth, high growth. Now I'll take you through in a minute. In industry funds, these are a bit sway, but this is a traditional strategic asset allocation based risk portfolios or risk profiles. So if you're on the lower end of a risk profile, you're very risk adverse, or you don't need to take much risk, the defensive portfolio is the least. And that's pretty much saying anywhere from 0 to 20% of your assets will be put into risky assets, so growth assets, shares, property, etc. The other 80 to 100% will sit in very safe assets, bonds, cash, etc. Because you don't have the ability to put much of that money at risk. So we need to protect a lot of it, but you're also not going to grow. Okay, that's a risk versus return. Not much risk, not much return. Then the next one up is conservative. And we'll generally see this around, the core portfolio for a lot of retirees or pre-retirees, where you have 20 to 40% of your money in growth assets, so shares, property, growing assets at risk, and the other 60 to 80 in defensive assets, so cash, bonds, etc. The next one up, which is supposed to be, you'd think it'd be 50-50, but we've seen to switch this as of recent, but is the balanced portfolio, which is, like it says, balance. You're half and half really. So 50 to 60% sitting, well, it's more like 40 to 60% sitting in growth assets, shares, bonds, etc., at risk. And then the other 60 to 40% sitting in defensive assets, cash, bonds, etc., being protected. That's a very common portfolio for people who invest outside of super to try and maintain a bit of that. But, again, you've got to really look at what your goals are and align that. Then we've got the growth portfolio. Now, this is most common that we see come through, where you got 60 to 80% of your assets at risk being invested in growth assets, and the other 20 to 40% in defensive assets. Now, you want to make sure you have a flexible portfolio too. That if you're not someone to look at this, then it doesn't matter. You just want to long term make sure it aligns with your goals, but you also want to make sure that you've got flexibility, so that if there's market issues happening or about to happen, you've got the ability to potentially protect a few more of your assets than what's at risk in the market. Because the more money that's in the market at risk during bad times, the more money you're going to lose. The less money you've got in the market in good times, the less money you're going to make. So that's a risk versus reward. But if you've got an advisor, an investment person, or you're good at it yourself, there is some benefit there to being able to stay flexible. However, you've got to be careful. I posted a story recently about an investment advisor mate of mine who had some clients who don't understand this shit. And they got in at a high time, sold out at a low time. And if they'd stayed in the market, they would have made over 100% by now. But their head tricked them, and they played with it a bit funny. Then we got the last one, which is high growth. Most of our clients is where they sit because they're young, they've a lot of time for super, for investments. And that means you're investing pretty much all of your money. So all your money's at risk, no defensive assets, it's all there to grow. So what we need to do is, as we get older, or as we get closer to our investment time horizon, the time that we're going to use that money we're investing, you really should be lowering that risk, because we don't invest year to year, we invest cycle to cycle. And if you've only got one cycle left, you don't know how long that cycle is going to be exactly. So you probably need to be holding a few extra assets. If you've got 5 cycles left, you've got more than enough time to make any losses back. So that doesn't matter as much. But that's how we look at our risk allocation to make sure that it's it's in line with our goals. Now, what's important to understand is when you're in something like an industry fund, they'll call a fund a balance, which generally a balance fund inside the industry funds at the moment sit around that growth to high growth. How they get away with it, I have no idea. It's just what they name their fund. But you got to understand that that doesn't mean necessarily that's what your allocation is. Okay, the allocation versus the name of the fund is completely different. So I hope that helped you guys understand a bit more about your risk allocation and your profiles. It's really important that you do understand these, because so many times we see people and they say, oh, no, I hate super. My grandparents lost all their money in super. Your grandparents didn't lose their money in super. Super is not an investment. It's a tax vehicle. The investment is held inside super, but it's got nothing to do with super. Super is just giving you a tax deduction for the trade-off of holding off on your money for some time. The reason they lost money is they were invested way too riskily for their age, and they hadn't gone and seen someone, they hadn't paid attention to their portfolio, and they copped it all. And then by the time that they need to use their money, they didn't have enough time to recoup their losses. So it had nothing to do with the super or the investment, rather than the fact that how much risk they were taking in that portfolio, because they didn't know what they were doing. So it's really important you understand this, and this plays a massive role in your investment timeframe. We're going to do an investment video later on, and I'll dive into this a bit more, but this is the first step: understanding your risk profiles, understanding how much risk you can tolerate, what your capacity for risk is, and how much risk you need, and then blending them together to come up with the perfect investment risk portfolio. Hope that helped. If you have any questions, reach out, and good luck.